to this next session. I'm going to sort of plunge straight in and introduce the first speaker, who is Marianne Kowalewski. Marianne is the Joseph Fitzpatrick S.J. Distinguished Professor Emerita of History and Medieval Studies at Fordham University in New York. Many of you know her work on medieval Exeter and maritime communities in general, and particularly her wonderful Medieval Londoners project, which I'm sure she'll say something about. So, Marianne.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's nice to see you all. I'm glad I'm at this point because I have just landed yesterday morning from New York, so this is keeping me awake. Now, in preparation for this roundtable, I read through a very large folder of handwritten letters from Derek, for those of you who know, in the 1980s and the 1990s. Why not later? That's because my file peters out in the early 2000s because we started using email. And I laugh about this because Derek and I had a running argument. I said, why are you writing anything handwritten to me all the time? All my letters to him were typewritten, whatever, and we had this huge argument. It was more personal, blah, he thought better, etc. So he's laughing right now that the letters that I have remaining are his handwritten letters and not all the email ones, because I lost those, because universities don't save that. We've changed, you've had 4 different email accounts since then. Anyway, that was my first part of my sample here. I'm a social science historian. And my second was, I actually surveyed, I did a little oral history of 10 of my North American colleagues, mainly medieval historians, but 2 literary scholars and also an early modernist, asking them what of Derek's publications were most influential, what do you remember about him in terms of his scholarship? First of all, I want to say a little bit about Derek's relationship with North America, which was a little bit of a love-hate relationship, although more love than hate. On the one hand, he loved visiting big American cities like New York and Chicago and kept in touch with several modern urban historians, such as those who worked on projects like an Encyclopedia of New York. He was invited to speak at places like the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Getty, although I never remembered if that was your speaking engagement and he just came along with you, Suzanne, or whether he actually spoke there. I actually first met him in 1982 at, of course, a Kalamazoo conference. He attended several times at sessions I organized there. Not surprisingly, he was especially sensitive to the architecture and streetscapes of big American cities, especially the landscape of shopping, which in one article he called sites of desire. Once, during a visit to my parents' house in Detroit, a Detroit suburb, after a Kalamazoo conference, my father was so inspired by Derek's works on shops and shopping, they insisted on taking Derek to Myers Thrifty Acres, which was one of the first of the big box stores in the United States. Derek was really intrigued to see firsthand the physical layout of suburban American consumerism, especially when accompanied by an enthusiastic commentary of my father. This was my father's favorite store because it was one-stop shopping. But Derek was also a huge fan of the American West. He loved rigorous climbing, but did admit that the unmanaged territory, I was actually surprised that he did admit that the unmanaged territory of the Rockies was more dangerous than he had anticipated, a comment he made after an especially challenging hike through the wilderness when he saw only bears and other wildlife and had to dodge falling rocks and scramble over dead tree trunks. But his tendency towards kind of comparative, thoughtful analysis cropped up even in these situations, as when he told me that the fallen trees at the higher elevations of the Rockies, which had lain undisturbed for generations, showed up as a trail, literally, of rotted wood crumbs across the rocks and grass, which made him think of Richard Long's work, something of which he had recently seen in the New York Museum of Modern Art. That was like pure Derek, making that kind of connection. His letters also include rapturous descriptions of the Colorado sand dunes, ruminations about the plight of the Navajo, and how ugly he found modern Denver after visiting picturesque small towns in New Mexico and Colorado. But he was impressed by the liveliness of downtown Denver, saying he saw more people who dressed like Francis and Thomas used to, this was 1993, than anywhere else in the United States. He was especially delighted to stumble across a pro-tobacco demonstration on the steps of the Colorado Capitol building that had been hijacked by pot smokers chanting, "No peace without pot." He was impressed by the laid-back response of the local police. So these kinds of cultural encounters gave him great pleasure, as did learning about other American traditions, especially of mine, that he found puzzling, like popularity of high school reunions. Why was I going? What did it mean? And also my great love for American baseball, which he tried to understand. Now, the hate part was reserved for U.S., not Canadian politics. He was especially against U.S. aggression in the Middle East, in the first Gulf War, and after the Gulf War in 2003, when George Bush was president, he vowed never to visit the States again until there was a, quote, regime change. He also objected when the U.S. began to require that non-citizens be fingerprinted on entry through U.S. customs, which is another reason he completely stopped coming to the United States. Now, just for a few words about Derek's impact on his scholarship on North Americans. Now, his magisterial 2-volume survey of medieval Winchester, published in 1985, had the biggest impact on me, actually, because I faced in my early work on the town of Exeter many of the same methodological issues that Derek had already worked through, such as how to classify occupations, how to estimate the size of an urban population when you don't have a census, what brewing finds can reveal. That's a small group of people that are very interested enough to write 3 pages in a letter about brewing finds in the urban economy, the management of urban properties by institutional landlords, and even the role of daughters and widows in the descent of urban properties and businesses, just to name a few. 5 of the 10 North American scholars I consulted had similar praise for Derek's work on Winchester. One of my own doctoral students, who of course had been assigned reading parts of medieval Winchester, remarked that the book, which she'd read in her entirety for her thesis, helped her at a very early stage of her development as urban historian, because it covered such a wide range of issues. She felt she was getting a kind of master course and introduction to medieval urban history by reading this book. Another scholar found Derek's book on Winchester to be remarkable, not only for his command of a huge empirical base, but also for his ability to see the forest as well as the trees. The survey of medieval Winchester was path-breaking also in its gazetteer of tenement histories over several centuries, accompanied by a biographical register of owners and tenants, which together came to almost 1,000 pages of text. This would all be on computer nowadays, on the website. The methodologies that Derek developed with this project were the foundation of the next big endeavor, the social and economic study of medieval London, which also constructed tenement histories for the 5 parishes in Cheapside, published as a born digital work with Vanessa Harding entitled The Historical Gazetteer of London Before the Great Fire, Cheapside. The project continued to grow thereafter with histories of Walbrook, the area around the Bank of England, Aldgate, and the Minories. The latter employed Martha Carlin, a prominent North American medievalist. The Great Wall of Cheapside, moreover, lives on. Actually, my university, Fordham University, has a website project called Medieval Londoners, and one of my students did an MA project called Get to Know Medieval Londoners, in which we scanned almost all of the 5x8 index cards with transcripts of the husting deeds that Vanessa was talking about. It's Vanessa and Derek's handwritings that have been scanned, and they're all available online on a big Zooniverse project now. I would love to know what he would think of that. Everyone I contacted mentioned Derek's works on London, but chose often to highlight different publications as especially influential on their own work. Several singled out his essay on Tanner's Widows for the volume on medieval London widows, published in 1994. One colleague who works on women's history said that unlike many people at that time who were, quote, popping into women's history from other fields and producing naive, oh wow, look at this essays, Derek's essay was very level-headed and measured. He saw what Tanner's widows could do, but he also saw what they could not do. Many also pointed out how influential Derek's work on urban topography had been, his sensitivity to space as a category of analysis, and the sophisticated perspectives that he added to traditional works that map, for example, the spatial distribution of occupations in medieval towns. The biographical details that accompany the tenement histories for Winchester and London have also provided very useful data for many researchers, and I'm talking here especially about myself for the Medieval Londoners Project. But one of my colleagues said that she always checks the online gazetteer when working on specific Londoners just to see if they're mentioned, and is often successful in finding them. Interestingly, Derek never called this work prosopographical, which I, as the developer of a large digital prosopographer of medieval wonders, again, wish he was here. Why did you never use that word? The other big project of Derek's that influenced North American scholars was the Feeding the City project, which I in particular found fascinating and rewarding because of my own work on hinterlands. But Derek and his team, several of them here today, went way beyond what other scholars accomplished in terms of the scale of their purview, and really the detailed research on all aspects of how London was supplied with essential goods, from compiling databases of cornmongers and woodmongers to analyzing common pleas debt cases and vast numbers of manorial records from the 10 counties surrounding the metropolis. The book on a medieval capital and its grain supply, mine is so dog-eared that it wasn't well-bound to begin with, but it's really fallen apart just because I consulted so often, as well as a whole slew of accompanying articles, have become really standard works in the field, which several of the North American scholars, particularly those in economic history, went out of their way to mention to me. I still have a multi-page letter from Derek that Derek sent me explaining his methodology for calculating transport costs in the London region by cart, river, and coastal shipment, accompanied by an enormous drawing of isoplyth lines to illustrate the cost of transporting a quarter of wheat to London. Because Derek's scholarship covers such a wide and astonishing range of topics, as we've seen, the North American scholars whom I consulted did bring up a few other specific publications which I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that had influenced their own work. These include his essay in French on the Hanseatic environment in London between the 12th and 17th century, which one scholar says answered most of her questions when she began to work on the issue of aliens in London, and which she still to this day cites in what she calls her obligatory footnote that she provides on, here's some literature on London aliens, and that's the first thing she cites. Another scholar brought up Derek's work on buildings and their inhabitants, such as the Hanseatic Steelyard and Mercer's Hall. Now, in closing, it's worth mentioning that all the scholars in my sample who knew Derek commented on his generosity to North American scholars, his willingness to answer questions, his phenomenal memory, and what one literary scholar termed his sheer niceness. His wide-ranging interests meant that he could find delight in everything from a suburban excursion to a big box store to, in my case also, identifying a mysterious non-Exeter tax roll that I had found in the middle of an Exeter mayor's court roll. And he the next letter, he'd identified it, where it was from, all things like that. I personally found his intellectual curiosity to be his biggest asset, which prompted our shared enthusiasm for such esoteric topics as urban taxes, occupational categorization, and brewing fines. But I also really often wonder what he would make of new research, especially on London, which is a topic I only began to be interested in a few years ago. Too late, unfortunately, for me to be able to mine his deep knowledge in this area. But my scholarship and that of other North Americans is significantly richer because of the meticulous scholarship of Derek Keene, especially his ability to formulate big questions and answer them through innovative methodologies, collaborative research, and hardcore archival research. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Justin.
Is that better at the back?
Is that better at the back? David says yes. Okay, so we'll move on to Professor Mark Brunner from Ghent University. Mark, as many of you know, is a distinguished historian of medieval urban society, a leading figure in organisations such as the International Commission for the History of Towns, as well as the European Association of Urban Historians, both organisations that Derek had significant connections with over the years. He's director of many research programmes at Ghent and elsewhere on themes such as state formation and medieval archives, and the author of a huge number of publications on many aspects of medieval towns and cities. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Mark.
So thank you very much, and thank you first of all for giving me the opportunity to reflect on the importance of Derek Keene's legacy seen from urban historians a little bit across the continent. Over the past decades, I had the opportunity, or to do justice to Derek and his influence, the good fortune to collaborate with Derek Keene at many an occasion and in many a configuration. Three of them stand out. First, between 2002 and 2017, he voluntarily accompanied a major research program on urban history financed by the Belgian science policy and involving several Belgian and Dutch universities. Second, at the beginning of the century, we were both engaged with a group of international colleagues in an ESF, European Science Foundation, research program called Cultural Exchange in Europe 1400-1700, which took off in 1997 and finally resulted, thanks to Derek, I come back on that, in the publication of 4 volumes by Cambridge University Press in 2007. And one of these volumes was dedicated to cities and cultural exchange in Europe. And thirdly, we were both active, as has been said, in the International Commission for the History of Towns as representatives of our respective countries. And Derek was a very active member of that commission between 1991 and 2015. At all these occasions, one fundamental characteristic of Derek stood out: his generous, open mind, suggesting possible broader outlooks to colleagues, and much more important, to younger prospective scholars whose career in academia was taking off as they prepared a PhD. His way of acting was characterized by a gentle approach, asking questions and proposing to look at it from a different angle. In doing so, he often invited to compare a city with, of course, other cities. This may sound evident, but it isn't necessarily so. Urban historians have one great advantage. Studying the history of a city implies an almost inevitable holistic approach, since different problematics take up on each other, thus avoiding the pitfall of only looking at economic or social or political or cultural processes. True urban history combines them all. However, that advantage can easily turn into a disadvantage by focusing too much on the one city under study, or even worse, to look for explications too much within the history of that single city. Therefore, urban history can inevitably gain huge profit from a resolutely comparative approach. Of course, this conclusion is far from new. Already the founding fathers of urban history, somebody like, for instance, Henri Pirenne, were quite outspoken in this respect and have promoted the idea of a comparative approach. What made Derek's position quite exceptional is that he not only kept on pleading for a comparative urban history, but enlarged this with a truly interdisciplinary line of approach. He may count, it has already been stressed, among one of the earliest and most convincing advocates of a resolutely integration of archaeology and history, as is abundantly demonstrated among other publications by his work on Winchester. Indeed, for many aspects of urban life in the Middle Ages, and certainly considering the early Middle Ages, archaeology is, given the relative scarcity of written sources, the golden way to new insight and a fresher look at things. This again may be considered common knowledge nowadays, or one may hope so, but Derek was among the first to emphasize and promote it. Derek had a vivid interest in the concrete. Studying a city was for him also walking a city. The sense of space and of the concrete circumstances city dwellers had to live in was for him, with good reason, an essential element of urban historical research. And personally, I remember very stimulating walks with him around St. Paul's here in London and in Cheapside. In the context of the International Commission for the History of Towns, he therefore was one of the driving forces in the group that promoted the elaboration and publication of historic town atlases. A European-wide endeavor launched in 1955 already, which is far from completed, but has so far yielded remarkable results, and where again the focus is no longer on one specific historical period, but it takes into account a much larger period than only the medieval, the early modern, or even the modern city. And here again, for the sake of better comparability, a set of guidelines was conceived, once more with Derek as one of the driving and inspiring forces. It may not be a total coincidence that the last publication of him listed on the website of the International Commission concerned the Historic Atlas of Winchester. It was published in the year 2017, when the disease was to bereave us from this remarkable historian had manifested itself for the first time. As I already mentioned, Derek's commitment for the cause of urban history was manifold, and he invested not only in pure scientific aspects. In the already mentioned ESF program on cultural exchange in early modern Europe, one of the 4 research teams focused on urban history. Both Derek and I took part in it. Due to the stormy side effects of some seemingly incompatible characters involved in the undertaking, the urban history group almost collapsed, were it not for Derek's capacities of building bridges, looking at essential things, and looking for compromises. That at that moment the European subsidies allowed to underpin the meetings with great meals was of course also important. By the way, over the years I discovered in Derek culinary taste somebody from the continent not necessarily associates with being English. But the essential breakthrough and the rescue of the whole undertaking depended on Derek's engagement. He worked, of course, during a time span in which historical research became resolutely collective. It was no longer the individual researcher wrestling with the sources in the intimacy of his or her office, but the inspirator of collective research programs who was to dominate the way actual research took place. And in that respect, Derek was the right man and the right period. In preparing this short intervention, I sent my preliminary text to the 2 closest colleagues who coordinated with me the Belgian Inter-University program on urban history. And one of them, my colleague and good friend Claire Billen from the Free University of Brussels, reacted immediately, among other things, by referring to a meeting in Paris organized by her brother, a biologist working in the French CNRS on pollution of rivers. And she had, of course, not at all expected to see Derek showing up in such a context. And a quote from her, I got quoted in the original French version. Quelle ne fut pas ma surprise me rendant un jour à Paris pour un colloque organisé par mon frère à Jussieu. Jussieu, that's the place where the natural science faculty of the Sorbonne is situated. Un colloque organisé par mon frère à Jussieu sur la question de l'empreinte écologique des villes, de rencontrer Derek parlant de Londres et jouant exactement le même rôle au milieu des biochimistes, des spécialistes de la pollution et des ressources hydrologiques que celui qu'il jouait parmi nous. Derek nous manque énormément. Ce que nous pouvons faire du mieux en sa mémoire est de poursuivre le travail, mais surtout de ne jamais oublier 2 choses: qu'il faut inlassablement chercher à réorienter la question que l'on pose à la réalité historique, et qu'il ne faut jamais se départir de la bienveillance quand on travaille avec des autres. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now we'll move on to Christian Liddy. Christian, as many of you again will know, is Professor of Late Medieval History at the University of Durham. He's researched and written on a number of topics in medieval urban history, and is a leading light in the pre-modern towns group here in the UK. He's worked on the relationship between the English crown and provincial towns and cities, as well as on citizenship and on discourses of politics and governance in English towns. So, Christian, actually, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, good. I hope what I'm about to say is not too serious. I promise this is not a research paper, but anyway, we'll see how it goes. I did not know Derek personally, like Marianne, and I did not collaborate and work together on research projects like Mark. I met Derek only a couple of times, but I felt his influence indirectly in all sorts of ways. In studying medieval London as an undergraduate with Caroline Barron and Vanessa Harding, and in doing my PhD at the University of York under the co-supervision of Professor Sarah Rhys-Jones, whose own work on the property and rents of late medieval York, I'm pretty certain was inspired by Derek's pioneering research on tenement histories in Winchester and London. Justin today has asked me to provide a kind of Forschungsstand, a kind of overview of recent developments in the histories of town politics and urban governance. So this is a slight kind of warning, this might get a bit serious. I promise I'm going to try to lighten the tone throughout. Derek, as we know, wrote widely about different aspects of London's early governance between 1000 and 1300. He wrote about the emerging structures and systems of civic administration, the growing corporate identity of the citizens expressed in both text and image. I think of that brilliant article in the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society. Whether it was in thinking about London's status as a particular type of city, a metropolis, or in exploring whether and in what ways London could be understood as a city-state, Derek was interested in identifying the qualities and characteristics that delineated the urban place. For Derek, one of the defining features of the city was its distinctive mix of spaces and buildings. And I want to return to this point about place or space towards the end of this very short paper. So we might begin this kind of overview, a kind of state of research, where are we in the study of politics and governance in the late medieval town. We might begin by asking, did urban politics have its own dynamics, or did it embody wider historical forces? And some scholars, such as the British historical sociologist Philip Abrahams, have argued that the town was not a unit of analysis in its own right, but a reflection of society. However, research on town politics and urban governance in late medieval and early modern Europe has been very clear. Politically, at least, the town was an analytical entity. Urban politics had its own areas of tension, sources of contention, and methods of adjustment and resolution to handle discontent. The issues disputed and fought over in towns crystallised around practices of urban oligarchy and urban citizenship. And I have contributed to some of this literature. But despite the range of insights that this research has generated, I want to suggest that urban historians, we collectively, need to bridge the gap that still exists between the social and political histories of pre-modern towns, and to move beyond a paradigm of urban politics confined to what seems axiomatically and unquestionably political. We should follow Derek's lead and consider more fully how the physical arrangement of a town or city shaped social relationships, which were not only political with a small p, but which were necessarily entangled in the public politics of the town, hall, or guild hall. In extending the parameters of town politics, we can better, I hope, accommodate and explain the peculiarities of the urban space. Models of town politics rest on a definition of politics that is reassuringly familiar and wholly conventional. While the size of the political community has grown under the sympathetic gaze of historians, our understanding of the dimensions of town politics has not. The focus remains the exercise of public authority within the urban polity, the texture of the relationship between citizens and town rulers, the apparatus, personnel, and actions of town government, as well as the disruptive effects of the abuse of power by individuals. We might ask, how far have urban historians travelled from the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Mark mentioned Purin, I'll do the same. Like his contemporary Henri Purin, Max Weber admired medieval European towns for their opposition to and rejection of traditional hierarchies of the feudal Middle Ages. They wrote about the democratic aspects of medieval towns, such as novel systems of voting. Weber and Pirenne identified a prefiguration of their own liberal bourgeois values and desires. Otto Brunner and others proposed an alternative history, the rise of urban oligarchy and urban magistracy, Obrigkeit. Heinz Schilling likewise resisted the temptation to view the pre-modern town through the lens of 19th century politics. His civic republicanism was not a modern anti-monarchical notion of republicanism, or a corpus of ideas derived from a classical concept of citizenship. Over the last 30 years or so, interest in political culture shifted historians' minds to discourse and ideas. And I chuckled, I have to say, rereading some of Derek's kind of witty asides about language and the attention that historians were belatedly paying language in the 1990s and early 2000s. Here, in looking at language, historians discovered townspeople's sophisticated political awareness, praised their political activism, marvelled at their unyielding belief in the value of representation and their insistence on the necessity of popular consent. Historians writing about urban governance and town politics in late medieval and to an extent early modern Europe wrote about the rhetoric of the common good, the bonum commune, that was ubiquitous in pre-modern urban communities. Yet in learning that citizens wrote manifestos, and that is indeed what we have learned over the last 20 or 30 years, in learning that the urban revolts that they led advanced political programmes, what should we conclude? Well, Martin Parr has concluded this, that there was more democracy before the French Revolution than historians have usually acknowledged. My question is, why do we want to find it? Political histories of pre-modern towns do not connect easily to the centres of politics favoured since the 1980s by social historians. And here I think Derek Keene's work is particularly important in pointing the way forward. For social historians, social relations were political because they were embedded within structures of authority, gender, patriarchy, work and class, and because the efficacy of those structures were dependent upon relationships of power. Social relations could be deferential, they could be consensual, but they were just as likely to involve conflict or at the very least negotiation. In thinking about work on town governance and town politics, studies of urban oligarchy and studies of urban citizenship have tended to marginalise or ignore completely the presence and influence of gender and class. In their place is the fetishisation of the categories of popular and ordinary. Town politics was popular because the actors were, I quote, I think I'm actually quoting myself, ordinary people, not Derek, ordinary people, ordinary citizens, common citizens. Ordinariness is questionable when the taxonomy discounts the experiences of women who are to concentrate on formal participation and representation alone, have no voice in urban politics. We should be sceptical too when the protagonists of urban politics turn out to be the urban middle classes, or the urban middling groups, or the urban middling sorts. This interchangeable terminology of social classification poses a further dilemma. Should we ally the differences between classes, groups, and sorts? Social and political historians, I think, talk past each other. We are left to decide whether town politics was essentially about government and its arena, the institutions of government, or whether politics was everywhere in everything. Why should we choose between two polarised positions, where the political is defined both too narrowly and too broadly? So the task, in looking ahead, thinking about where we are now, I think, is to bring together the social and the political. We should do so for three reasons, all of which would have resonated with the inhabitants of late medieval towns, and all of which Derek himself, I think, would have appreciated. First, townspeople inhabited diverse, overlapping communities, such as the family, the household, the workshop, the neighbourhood, the parish, the citizenry. Each was an interconnected centre of power. Town councillors, mayors and aldermen were themselves citizens, heads of household, employers, neighbours and parishioners. Secondly, and I'm thinking here directly or specifically of Derrick's work on Cheapside and his parishes in Cheapside, those who held political power lived within settlements that, however much they expanded between the 16th and 18th centuries, comprised face-to-face communities. Townspeople were in daily personal contact with their governors. And thirdly, town leaders were typically drawn from the very people they ruled. They might hold power one day, but power could in theory, and did quite often in practice, pass quite easily to a fellow citizen, a neighbour the next. This was the nature of civic office. Altogether, the experience of authority in towns was distinctive. Day-to-day politics in town was the politics of people's daily lives, all of which was enmeshed in the politics of government. So, to conclude, Max Weber encouraged historians to examine the question of public authority in towns, to treat it as a problem that was present at the moment of their creation. Thinking about London and the beginning of London's commune, for example, or looking at the emergence of urban communes elsewhere in medieval Europe. Weber encourages to think about the emergence of those communes and to think about really the problems that the creation of communes, the creation of town governments like London, city governments like London posed, problems that were never entirely resolved. What did self-government entail? To whose benefit or at whose cost was it achieved? Town politics in this model centred on the town hall, and it revolved around the making, remaking and contesting of civic authority. When historians looked at urban oligarchy, their attention turned to the reduced size and diminished role of the enfranchised community of urban citizens in formal politics. And then, thinking about the reaction in the historiography, in the next stage of the historiography, the scholarship on urban revolt underlined the role of conflict within town politics. Yet if we no longer see town politics as the postponing or avoidance of violence, the themes of representation and participation persist. These issues were important to townspeople, but were they truly at the heart of urban political life? Derrick pointed us elsewhere. In reconstructing the histories of town properties, he revealed where people lived and encouraged us to think about how they lived and where and how they worked, how they cohabited. His interest was in townspeople's everyday experiences, all of which were connected to larger political questions. That project, wonderful project on the feeding the city. How does a city feed itself? Is an economic question, but of course it is a political question. And a political question because it had a particular meaning, or urban autonomy rather, had a particular meaning. What did urban autonomy mean in that kind of, in terms of subsistence, in terms of food? Beyond the sphere of organised labour, guilds I mean of course, the economic agenda of the craft guilds, the social and economic tensions prevalent in late medieval times do not feature as prominently as they might in history of town politics. They are the domain of a type of social history that I think is sealed off in turn from political history. Social history ought not belong exclusively to the social historian. The fascination of town politics, as Derrick showed, is the implication of the social and the political in ways that made it a permanently unstable field of action and ideas. And the starting point must be the complexity of urban social relations in which it was not always clear and entirely clear precisely where power lay. Thank you.
Thank you to all three speakers. Some really interesting connections both across continents but also between disciplines and sub-disciplines which came out particularly in Christian's discussion there. So again, we have some time for questions. I think till 4:30, is that right, Justin? Yeah, so we're good for time. So does anyone want to make any comments either from the panel or from the audience about what you've just heard, and any things those have sparked off in your minds about Derek's work and its influence that you have. Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to ask Christian a question, because I think it was a really interesting sort of call to arms in a sense you were finishing there, and to take the example of feeding the city, and I can see Jim Galloway and Margaret Murphy out there. How would you imagine taking forward projects and work such as that in a way that's going to create a kind of fusion, synergy between the school and social history in that sense?
Well, Marianne's, and actually I think Caroline's heard me talk about this. I gave a paper at the Late Medieval Seminar at the IHR earlier in the year, and I actually was talking specifically not about London, but I was talking about Norwich. And I was talking about moments of one particular food, what you might call a kind of food riot in Norwich in the 1530s. It involves women in which has been really, I mean, it's a classic thing for historians today, it's been ignored, but it seems to me it's particularly interesting. This is a conflict about food and the provision of food within the city. It's about subsistence, it's about the nature of the household and the maintenance of the household, it's about stability of the household, about all sorts of things like that. So I think that in looking again at some of these moments of conflict, we can certainly bring the social and political together. I suppose the other thing that I think has been really interesting in terms of thinking about food, and one of the things that I've always thought was really interesting is how often, for example, in kind of town chronicles, I know we often talk about London town chronicles of the 15th century, they're probably the most famous, certainly in an English or British context, but there are town chronicles for other towns and cities as well. And one of the interesting things about those town chronicles, which are often really laconic, they're more like annals, but they comment very briefly on the price of grain, they are very conscious of those sorts of things. So I suppose in a way, it is the way to combine that project on feeding the city with what I'm suggesting is to look much more kind of within the city and what happens in terms of distribution of food within the city and the kind of tensions that creates. So I think that the evidence is definitely there, but it's also about, I think, broadening a sense of what is political. And we use the term citizens. I've written about citizens, but as Marianne pointed out in her work on Exeter, if we just look at those, they are a relative minority of the whole population. And it's once we think, I think about urban households and actually think about tenement issues and properties and those kind of the social relations that emerge from the study of property, I think that we can perhaps bring social and political together. So.
I think this, and while you were speaking, I was thinking of work by Charlotte Berry.
Yes,
Charlotte Berry, who works on the margins of society in a way in which you sort of delve down beneath the citizenry a bit more, and using some of Derek's methodologies actually to do that. Which is really interesting. So it's my personal interest. Comments on the floor, Mark? Or? We'll give you a microphone as well.
As a dirt archaeologist from Oxford, I found what Christian just said inspiring. And my first question was, is he going to publish that, and how soon? But my second thought was for the speaker generally, is there anything that they think Derek himself would have felt he had, anything other than your points that Derek himself would have felt that he had left unfinished?
Good question. Good question. We'll maybe start with Christian.
No, I'm just going to mention something briefly. So, I mean, for me, the answer to that is that his history of early medieval London. I mean, we talked about it constantly in the last 10 years, and I never was sure how much progress he was making on it, but it was really the most important project in his mind, especially going into, and I have no idea, are there chapters anywhere? I'm not sure.
Can you repeat what it was?
It was a history of early medieval London. So it was a predecessor to Caroline's book. So Caroline starts, I mean, she really starts before 1300, but that's the late medieval, and this was going to be the earlier period. He had lots of new ideas. He really was constantly telling me, oh, so-and-so was wrong about this, and, it was a kind of classic Derek thing. And I kept thinking, well, I can't wait to see that in print, but he didn't write very much about it. It was always something that was on the books, and I'm curious, did he write chapters? I mean, he occasionally talked about it with me that literally the last 10 years, that was his major project, aside from finishing up was what was with the Center for Metropolitan History. And he was going to use archaeology a lot.
Suzanne is probably
Suzanne
the person
maybe
to
might
tell us.
tell us that.
Well, I can throw a little bit of light. Yes, everybody was absolutely dying for Derek to get going on this great history of London. And he got as far as negotiating an agreement, I think, with CUP.
Oh, you
But,
did, yeah.
yeah, I think so. But he had a list of victims who he was going to get to write chapters. So it would have been like St. Paul's, which some of you remember perhaps quite vividly, perhaps painfully. So he was going to outsource a lot of this, and of course write a lot himself. It's very interesting that when I was going through Derek's books and things and collecting up the ones that he himself had authored, I think he only was the single author of one book, that Winchester one. Everything else was he'd edited it or written jointly, as well as, of course, a huge stack of individual articles he'd written. So I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't realised that. I think in a way one of the books he most enjoyed working on was it called The Singularities of London?
Yes.
Yes, right. Who did he edit that with? Somebody
Well,
else?
I have a story about that, too.
Oh, right. No, he loved working on that and finding the
He did.
illustrations,
He did.
telling me all about this and that.
I think there were projects like the St. Paul's history, which completely represented Derek's approach to collaboration. But they could also drive you nuts because they were incredibly complicated to organise and deliver and so on, but they were really represent. I think just on the early medieval history, yes, I mean, Derek got as far as talking to OUP about it. We had agreements, we had authors identified. I was going to be one of them. I never got around to mine either. So that's an unfinished, it was a hugely ambitious project, of course, but it never happened.
Hi, Marianne. It's really good to hear your talk, Christian, because it reminds me of many conversations I had with Dad while in his workshop or chatting on the phone, and how he a few times mysteriously would say, well, we talk a lot about politics, and he'd mysteriously say, a lot of what I'm thinking about you just won't understand for a very long time. And particularly talking about the emergence of the politics of the city. So it was really good to hear that, and how a contemporary politics has arisen through the sort of materiality of the city. All of the things were really resonated, so it was really great to hear what you were saying. It's kind of ended up incorporating that into my own work as I sort of stumbled into academia in later life. So the sort of themes of governance, how authorities working, all of these kinds of things. Grain markets, constantly talking about grain markets and stuff. All of these things really, really sort of resonate. And yeah, he's thinking deeply, I think, about what they mean today. What do we see today? How today's contemporary experience, how has it come to be? And the physicality, materiality of it, I think is really, really key. In fact, yeah, I was chatting to him in my sort of area, I look at technical objects, physical objects, and think of their politics. And we were just starting to have the beginnings of sort of conversations about that. I was getting my head around it and coming to understand it. So, so thank you all. There's sort of lots of connections. It brought back a lot of memories.
I suppose today also, given that access to and control of resources is such a huge geopolitical issue as well, that has so much sort of contemporary reference to it, doesn't it? And water, gas, fuel, all those things. Distribution. Carol.
Thank you very much. This has been a tremendous afternoon, and I've learned a lot and thought and remembered a lot. I was just thinking about that lost book on early medieval London that we all wished Derek had written. I mean, of course, the chapter that he wrote in the Urban History was a good start, as it was, a brilliant start. And I was thinking about why did he not write that book? And I thought about how is it that I came to write the volume I did. And it was because I taught. I had to teach a course on London between whatever it was, 1400, 1600 or something. And Derek didn't have to do that. So he could go on writing those brilliant articles on perceptions and aspects and ideas about medieval London. He didn't have to do a teaching course, which would have helped him actually to write the book. So we should have got him to teach a course, and then he would have written a book. And I just want to say one thing. This is a personal thing about Derek. I was working on London history in the 1960s and 70s, and it was my patch. And then suddenly there's this new kid on the block who comes in, and he's brilliant, and he raises money. And I remember going to a session at the Institute of Historical Research, chaired by Christopher Brooke, about raising money for Derek's projects and how we were going to do that. And I remember thinking a little bit, hang on, this is my topic. But actually, of course, there's room in London for lots and lots of people to work on it. And all I'd like to say is that actually, because Derek came to work on medieval London, I became a better historian. And I'm grateful to him for that.
I think many of us would. Anyone else like to come in from the floor? Vanessa.
I'd just like to say how much I've enjoyed hearing all these different memories of Derek and what he gave to them and what people took from that. But I was particularly struck by the fact that both Marianne and Mark mentioned Derek's love of walking, or his enthusiasm for walking around places. And obviously this tied into his sense of understanding the urban environment, the texture of the urban environment. And the only thing I was going to say was that there was one occasion on which he and I were walking from the Museum of London to a seminar at the Institute of Historical Research. And I happened to be wearing very high-heeled boots on that day. Anybody who's walked anywhere with Derek knows that he was extremely tall, long-legged, and extremely fast walking. And I have literally, it must be 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, I've never forgotten trying to keep up with him as we walked through the streets of London.
Richard Dennis.
Connected to that last comment, for a very long time, of course, one of the things that Derek was responsible for at the CMH was running the Wednesday afternoon seminars, the sort of predecessor of almost what we're at now. And one summer term, it was agreed that we should try and keep going seminars, but we do them by having a walk from Senate House in a random direction. Now, of course, given that it was Derek, we didn't get very far, actually. Although he walks fast, we would stop every 5 yards or so to talk about something new. But it was also an interdisciplinary and a collaborative walk. In other words, everybody was encouraged. It wasn't Derek leading the walk. We were all stopping every 5 yards to add our 3 pence worth into the discussion. And that's another, I think, of these aspects of Derek's stimulation of interdisciplinarity, that everybody could contribute to understanding the environment of London. And just to end that comment, I'd say that when I eventually, rather late in the day, got my own chair in historical geography, I asked Derek to give the vote of thanks, not because I wanted him to say something nice, but because I knew he would say something much more critical and analytical, that would ask questions and would take what I had to say seriously, rather than the sort of standard vote of thanks, which is, let's all go and have a drink now. And Derek certainly lived up to what I expected of him on that occasion, and gave a brilliant post-lecture lecture
on what I had to say. So I will remember Derek for things like that.
Thank you. We might have time for one more.
Sorry, just 2 seconds. And it's I went on one of those walks with, maybe you were on it as well, and I filmed it. And I've got to go into that cardboard box, having moved studios many times, to find the footage, because I filmed everybody's contributions, and you're right about the pace. I remember we went to the Clark's Well in Clerkenwell. We did actually get there, but we stopped first of all in Russell Square to look at to talk about Russell Square and what went on in the bushes. They just they sort of breathed and done it, like made it look nice again. And they were growing the grass, and they put these fences, and I can't remember what they were made of. Maybe somebody else knows, beach or something. I don't know. Anyway, but he talked about the materiality of the fence and what it was doing, and why they'd chosen this particular wood, and where it was harvested. And I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And then we also ended up having conversations not just with the historians who were there, but with passers-by. And we're followed for quite a way by a very interesting woman who was in quite a lot of difficulties, but perhaps a bit inebriated. But it was really wonderful because she also contributed her thoughts on the street and what it meant and how she interacted with the street. And it was just one of those extraordinary events, and the memory of it is probably better than my footage. But if I can find it and put it together, I will
It'll be really
do something with
It'd
it.
be
Send
great.
it to Susanna.
It'd be great to have that, yeah.